My interest in piracy and pirates goes back literally 60 years. When I was 9 years old, at the end of my third grade year, I was in Decatur, Alabama, and they had a book fair every year in the spring, and the idea was they would get kids to buy books, and they would read them over the summer, hopefully, and then they would donate them to the school in the fall. And I was just finishing up third grade, and so I was precocious is one word for it. I was a Scot, so I was single-minded, and I was more interested in a book that was on the 7th grade table than in one that was on the 3rd grade table. And that was Treasure Island. So I got Treasure Island and fell so in love with it that in the fall I didn't hand it in. And that book stayed with me for a long time, and it was quickly followed by Robinson Crusoe and Swiss Family Robinson, because what could be better for a young boy than tales of piracy and ships, and now every time I see one I worry. But so I know Bob well. We sing together in the Shanty Crew, and he's not here tonight, which I think is an act either of great intelligence or cowardice. I'm not sure which. As long as he's not here, there's only one way to start off a presentation on pirates. 15 men on a dead man's chest, yo-ho-ho, and a bottle of rum. Drink, and the devil had done for the rest, yo-ho-ho, and a bottle of rum. The mate was fixed by the boatswain's pike, the boatswain brained with the marlin spike, and Cookie's throat was marked delight. It had been gripped by fingers 10, and there they lay, all good dead men, like raisin sun on a dozen kin, yo-ho-ho, and a bottle of rum. So anyway, so it's there. So you don't have to be here long in Southport before you hear about Stede Bonnet, the gentleman pirate. And it's a great story, and it's wonderful, and it gets your attention, and you find it mentioned places, and we've got Bonnet's Creek, and there's all this stuff going on. We have a little bit of a problem. There is so much history and so few facts. And these are some of the books that I have leaned upon as I've got this presentation ready to go. What I discovered is that pirates are such a good story, we don't really want to let the facts get in the way. And so we haven't. And we've gone through periods. There was a famous exposition in England at one of their museums in the late 1990s that tried to take an in-depth look at piracy. It was the first time somebody had really studied it hard. And one of the books that's up here is basically a summary of that exposition, written by the guy who put it together. But every time we start to develop information about it, the Walt Disney Company comes out with a new version of Treasure Island, or somebody has the Black Flag, or whatever, and Pirates of the Caribbean, and once again, romance takes off and away we go. So the actual pirates were equally fascinating. The golden age of piracy was very short. It basically ran from 1690 to 1725. So it was not a long expanse. And it occurred during a period where we had relative peace in the world. The French, the English, the Spanish, the Dutch had been fighting forever over the New World. And most people don't know where the Spanish Main is. The Spaniards came across, they went to the coast of Middle and South America. That became the Spanish Main. We read all the time about the West Indies. Well, I think of where India is. No, the West Indies were where we thought India was. It's all of the Caribbean islands. This chain that runs right through here are the West Indies. Because as far as the explorers knew, that was the western side of India. They didn't realize there was a country and an ocean in between. So this area was rife with development starting in the 1500s. As you had explorers coming through from Spain, from Portugal, from England, from France, looking at this new area to see what they could. It was the age of colonization and colonialism, and boy, they were looking to see what they could pull out in the way of resources. So maps at the time, as it turns out, maps are not very dependable. Maps at the time painted a sort of a view of what the world looked like at that point, but they had a problem with perspective and distances and frequently with direction. What drove the settlement of the New World was basically the wind and the currents. So if you look at this map, it shows you where the primary currents are in the North Atlantic and South Atlantic Oceans. Basically, sailing ships, while they are incredibly romantic and they look really neat, are not tremendously efficient in that they do not go well in all directions. They go where the wind and the water takes them. And so if you look at the North Atlantic, we all think on a regular basis about the Gulf Stream, which comes down, goes into the Gulf, heats up the water, heads up the coast, our coast, crosses basically where the Outer Banks are with the Labrador Current, which is coming down, and then goes up north. It also peels off and comes over to the coast of Africa. So if you wanted to get somewhere, you wanted to go with the currents. That says if you were coming from England, you hopped over and caught the Labrador Current down, and you basically settled the northern part of the American continent. If you were Spanish or French, you went down and picked up the Azore, which becomes the Gulf Stream, and you came across this way. This obviously is the area where the Spanish Main developed. And so people went with where the current would take them. The story on Stede Bonnet begins on the island of Barbados. So for those of you who don't know where Barbados is, it is the easternmost island in the Caribbean chain. It is tiny. Its advantage is from a defensive position because the current comes this way. You can't sneak up on it from the back. It was incredibly difficult for any sailing ship to come in from the western side and sneak up on it. You could come down with the tail end of the Labrador Current, but it wasn't easy. The predominant current was heading off in that direction. And so this sort of was the outpost. This was the first spot that you ran into. It was discovered initially by a Spaniard and then a Portuguese. There were some indigenous people on it, not very many. Nobody could make a go of it. Later on it gets settled by the English. 166 square miles. To put that in perspective, Brunswick County is 880 square miles. So we're talking 1/5 the size of Brunswick County. So it was not real large. It is unusual in that it does not have any permanent lakes or rivers on it. And so it was dependent upon a rainy season, which ran from June to October, which some of us refer to as hurricane season. And so it got a lot of water for a short period of time and then not a lot of water otherwise. And so it does have an aquifer. It's got some underground water, which is apparently the quality on it's very good, but it's not a lot because when it fills up, it runs into the ocean. And so it's got a set capacity. Barbados, with that funny spelling, first appears on Spanish maps in 1511. And it's referred to by King Ferdinand of Spain as Los Barbados. They saw it, they mapped it, they put it in the wrong place, but how could you tell? 1532, the Portuguese come through. When the Portuguese come in, they discover it again. It was completely uninhabited. They saw indications that it had been, at some point it had an indigenous population, but you're in the middle of nowhere. And it wasn't easy to support anything there. Portuguese had no reason to stay. They were really interested more in the southern part of the Spanish Main. In 1627, those pesky Englishmen appear. So I grew up, if the Milner family has a crest, it's going to be frequently wrong but never uncertain. And I had this impression of England as this monolithic world power. And it was incredibly significantly powerful. But there were lots of divisions going on within England as we went through the fight between the Stuarts and the Charleses and all the fallout from different groups. Some of that was religious in nature. The Stuarts, Roman Catholic, Some people in England didn't want to have Roman Catholic running the world, and so they wanted to go with somebody who was Protestant. And so that gets into what becomes the English Civil War, which most of us have never heard about. February 17th of 1627, 80 English settlers with 10 slaves who they claimed were captured at sea. I have my doubts about that, but be it far from me to... I'm setting a clock so I know how much time I'm taking up. So they come and they land on the island of Barbados at a place that gets called St. Jamestown. Gated community, cursed from the start. So I lived there. So, February 25th, the English King Charles I gave a gentleman by the name of Corton, by royal letters, patent to the proprietary ownership and title to the various lands in the southern Americas. Corton says, that means that I get Barbados. 4 months later, King Charles gives John Hay, the first Earl of Carlisle, by royal letters, patent to the proprietary ownership of the Caribbean islands, which happens to be in the same spot, right? And so you've got two competing groups that want to take over this island that nobody knows what to do with. 1636, they have the first proprietary slave laws enacted, stating that slaves were not indentured, which means that you could, if you were an indentured person, you had a period of servitude, either as part of a criminal conviction or for pay. At the end of that servitude, you became a freeman. Slave laws were passed enacting that slaves were not indentured and were property. The Parliament, which was the House of Assembly, then known as the House of Burgesses, held its first meeting. So they had their first semi-democratic gathering in 1639. So they were way early in the democracy race. They were one of the first three in the world, Virginia being slightly earlier than they were. Barbados was basically populated by people who came over, didn't have a whole lot of money necessarily, but they wanted a chance to have a piece of land. And if you lived in England or in the British Isles at the time, you were pretty much stuck with what you were born with. There was not a lot of flow of wealth because people could not accumulate capital. So if you were born poor, you died poor. If you were born rich, you died rich. Occasionally, you died early when you were rich, or you died early when you were poor, but there wasn't a lot of movement between these groups. It was the way it worked, the way the system was set up. So Barbados has all of these little farms of people who came over to settle because it gave them a chance to get a piece of land, which was not going to happen if you lived in England, Ireland, Scotland, or Wales. 1640, those pesky Dutch show up. And they say, hey, you know, we've had real luck growing sugarcane in Indonesia. And it's really lucrative. It's not that hard to grow. It's incredibly labor intensive, but it's not a difficult plant to grow. And you can make a lot of money because you take the sugar cane, you come up with molasses, and then somebody in Barbados discovers that if you distill the molasses, you come up with rum. And rum is normally accredited with being the birthplace. Barbados is the birthplace of rum. And so it became attractive. Prior to that, most of the agriculture on Barbados was cotton and tobacco, which are small plot crops. If you've got a quarter of an acre, you can put a bunch of tobacco plants in and you can grow it. And you've got to take it somewhere to dry it and process it, but you can grow it. Cotton, because we're talking prior to the cotton gin, was something that you could grow it in a very small area. If it would grow based on your soil, it would grow almost unimpeded. So it was not difficult to grow cotton. It was just really difficult to harvest it. It was all done by hand, and it was done again on small plots. Boy, if you're growing sugar cane, bigger is better, because you want to process it, you want to grow it, cut it, take it to a windmill, grind it down immediately, turn it into sugar, and go. And it naturally loaned itself to these larger plantations. So the landed gentry on Barbados started to buy up all the small farms. And instead of having 50 small farms, you had one really big one, and somehow or another, the people that were the landed gentry were the ones who did all the buying. And so you had a significant immigration of whites, an out-migration of whites, to Jamaica and the Carolinas. To give you an idea, in 1640, there were 37,000 whites on Barbados and 6,000 blacks. By 1684, there were 20,000 whites and 46,000 blacks, and the blacks were slaves, primarily. Some were indentured. But what happened is all the small landowners got pushed out because it became more lucrative to have the large plantations. 1652, the Barbadian law was passed establishing a militia to protect against slave rebellions because the numbers were starting to be lopsided and everybody was worried that there would be rebellions and uprisings. And basically, it was dependent on a system of having the larger landowners become the hubs for these individual militias around the island. And so they assigned titles to those landowners based upon the amount of land that they owned. That becomes important when we get to Major Stede Bonnet, who was born to Edward and Sarah Whetstone Bonnet, christened at Christ Church Parish on July 29, 1688. He was the great-grandson of Thomas Bonnet, who had gotten to Barbados between 1625 and 1647 and was one of the earliest settlers of Barbados. He was named after Edwin Stede, who was the governor of Barbados at the time of his birth and who was a close friend of his father, Edward Bonnet. So he was born into a prestigious family. Older brother, two younger siblings, two sisters, Frances and Sarah. He lived on a 400-acre plantation, which is a lot of land, which was later named Upton. At that time it was unnamed. Had a staff of 3 indentured servants and a workforce of 94 slaves. It was as close to a life of luxury as you could have in that era. They still didn't have indoor plumbing, but other than that, it was pretty nifty. A lot of money, comparatively speaking. A house in town, a house out on the plantation, or whatever your farm was called at the time. Opportunities for education, good involvement in the church. Unfortunately for Stede, his father and then his mother died 7 months apart in 1694. When his mother died, he and his 2 sisters were placed under the guardianship of a gentleman by the name of John Gibbs. And we don't know much about him other than he appeared when Edward Bonnet had died. In the 7 months between Edward Bonnet's death and his mother's death, this gentleman comes in and starts advising her. When she dies, he becomes the guardian for the estate. By 1699, a petition was brought before the Barbados Council requesting that the guardianship be transferred from Gibbs to Jeanette Whetstone, who was of the family of Stede's mother. She was the widow of John Whetstone, who was the former Deputy Secretary of Barbados. So he was very much in that insular community that ran Barbados. Mrs. Whetstone was determined that he would get a liberal education. She had had a fair amount of prestige when she was the wife of the Deputy Secretary. She had less, obviously, when she became the widow thereof, because we did not value women then like we do now. But she was determined that Stede and his 2 sisters were going to be raised correctly. And so they were going to be well educated, they were going to be aware of the church, and they were going to be aware of the responsibilities that went with being landed gentry in an English colony. Mrs. Whetstone remained his guardian until her death in 1708, which was about when Stede received his majority, was old enough to take over the estate. So he picks up a 400-acre estate and all of its management. It is almost entirely devoted to growing sugarcane. It still has that workforce of, by that time it was over 100 enslaved people. It was a big concern. He also had a house in Bridgetown, which was the port and the nice place to be. Based upon his original inheritance and land he was given as the dowry of his wife, Mary Allambie, he became a major based upon that law that said that we're going to assign military titles based upon how much land you have. So he becomes a major without having ever received any formal training in military affairs, without ever having been involved in a fight. But he's major, it's an honorary title, but it carries, again, that prestige. He had married at 21, he married a 16-year-old young lady by the name of Mary Allenby, who was the daughter of Colonel Williams Allenby, who also was very much in that insular landed gentry. The two of them had 4 children. Allenby, who was christened May 17th, 1712, and who passed away in 1714. Edward, who was christened September 24th, 1713. Stede Jr., who was christened September 14th, 1714. And Mary, who was born in early 1717. So the reason I don't have a date that Mary was christened, and you'll notice that they give the christening date and not the birth date, because we didn't really keep track of people when they were born, because so many of them died. We didn't really pay attention to them until they were christened, is we did not keep the same kind of records on young women that we did on men, because it was the hierarchical structure of the time says that we did not pay as much attention to those women. We know that Stede Bonnet was impacted by the death of his first son. We do not know the extent to which he was. So one of the problems that I've run into as I researched Stede Bonnet is the number of people who tell you that he was off his rocker. It's hard to tell whether he was going through a midlife crisis or a major meltdown, but one way or another his behavior begins to change. He's a voracious reader. He has over 200 books in his library. This is at a time when owning a book was a major investment, and quite frankly, the suspicion was that he owned a fifth of the books on Barbados. He was that much of a reader. And a lot of the stuff that he read, the current stuff, dealt with people who were voyaging around the world. Captain Cook, Captain Kidd, these guys were glamorous, they were adventurers. Yeah, they got killed by natives or hung on the beach, but they wrote great books before that happened, right? Could happen to anybody. And this was an era when it was a really big deal to go out and explore. I mean, it really was the new age for exploration, and so people were going everywhere. So he's reading all this stuff. A voyage of the South Sea and around the world would fit him just fine, and it turns out that a copy of this, a little bit of this was found in the Queen Anne's Revenge when it was salvaged, and they think it was his book. And so it's the kind of thing that he would read. He decides that he wants to become a pirate. Why not? My brother and I reached a similar decision when I was about 11. I was just talking with my dad about it. You got to have a ship. Ours was made out of styrofoam packing crates for typewriters that we got at my dad's office, and crates that, the packing crates that were available at the time. My mother, who, bless her soul, was always tolerant, helped us build a sail. We took it out. We were living in Alabama at the time. We went out on the Tennessee River, and we discovered that sailboats go one way. And when you want to get back, you got a problem. Fortunately, my father, who has a sense of humor, took it as a learning opportunity, and after he brought us back, said, okay, guys, you got to understand how boats work. And that is, you got to tack and all this other stuff. Well, there isn't exactly a keel when your boat is made out of styrofoam boxes and wood. December 13th, 1716, a gentleman appears in Barbados sailing a small 60-ton Bermuda sloop. He had come immediately from Charlestown, South Carolina. He was actually based in Rhode Island. The boat was made in Bermuda. So we have approximate dimensions on it. It was registered as a 60-ton vessel, which says it probably was about 70 feet at the waterline, had an overall length of about 95 feet because this particular type of sailboat had an extremely long bowsprit so that you could put additional foresails on it, would be about 18 feet wide, and it would had a draft probably of around 8 feet 6 inches. Stede Bonnet takes out a loan, 1,700 pounds, about $400,000 in today's terms, buys the boat for cash, takes it to a shipyard and says, I want you to modify it for me. Would you please make it so that it could mount up to 12 cannons, could provide accommodations for 100 men, and could house a library of at least 200 volumes, because no good captain would go to sea without his entire library. And so he built the boat accordingly. The Bermuda sloop was modified from a Dutch design, and it was fore and aft gaff rigged. So we've got somebody who's a much better sailor than I. We had two types of sailboats at that time, three types. We had square riggers, right? Big flat sail that basically was attached to the mast in the middle, extended equally on both sides, was really good at going in front of the wind. Not so good at tacking into it. The second type of sail rig that was widely available at the time was latrine rigged, which was popular in the Mediterranean and in parts of the Pacific, which is a sail that has a boom and the latrine on top of it. So you get a big triangular sail that's it's efficient, it's hard to manage because you got a lot of wood in the air that you've got to manipulate. And finally, we had fore and aft rigged, which is what we normally think of sailboats as looking like, where you've got a jib and a mainsail that are rigged fore to aft. It's much more maneuverable. It's capable of pointing much higher when you're trying to sail into the wind. So this particular boat, with its shallow draft, was capable of carrying relatively large loads up and down the coast. Bermuda gets in the business of making these things because they had a supply of cedar there in Bermuda. The cedar was desirable. It was as hard as oak, but it was substantially lighter. It had a lot of resin in it so that it was resistant to rot and to most of the naval boring worms, more resistant. So oak, if exposed to seawater and left untreated and unexamined, probably had a life expectancy of about 15 years. Cedar, so the story goes, could last as long as 25 years before it became so rotted that it would fall apart. So cedar was used to build the bones of the boat, which basically was the keel and the ribs. The sails were made either of linen or canvas. So the things you learn. Linen. Anybody know what linen was made from? Flax. Right. So it was lighter, still relatively stiff. Or canvas. Anybody know what the derivation of the word canvas is? Cannabis. Canvas at that time was made out of hemp, which now I learned they were not high all the time. There's hemp that has very fibrous and has very little CDB or whatever it is, the good stuff in it, and then there's the stuff that we've developed that'll get you high. It was a long, stringy fiber, and hemp was used exclusively or extensively for weaving the sails. The canvas sails were made largely out of hemp at that time, and also for making most of the lines. The lines were all saturated with naval stores being the pine pitch and things that were derived from it here in North Carolina. We need to remember that at one time, North Carolina provided 95% of the naval stores to the British Empire. So this was the place, if you wanted to get pitch, tar, and resin, turpentine, this was the place that you came. They were beautiful boats. They really were. But because of that fore and aft sail rig, they looked fast. They looked good. Now, when you get a full rigger, a square rigger, out running before the wind, and you've got the stustles out, it's billowing and it's great. But as soon as you have to turn anywhere, it's not equipped to do that, right? It goes really well in front of the wind and not very well into it. These ships were capable of sailing into the wind, or much closer to into the wind. A single raked mast. Now, at the time, sloop was usually used to describe not the number of masts it had, but its general purpose. And sloops at that point, along with pinks and some other things, were these coastal boats that tended to be that fore and aft rig. So they were gaff rigged, which means that your mainsail had a boom across the bottom attached to the mast, and then a gaff across the top. And so that gave you the ability to raise and lower the sail responsively, but it took a lot of manpower to do it. So these boats tended to take more manpower than did your square-rigged sailboats, which could be handled by, comparatively speaking, a smaller number of people. So these boats are known for this extensive use of foresails. For those of you who have some feel for how sailboats actually work, we know that yes, the wind can push you, but what really makes you go is just like an airplane wing rises because you've got air moving faster on one side than it is on the other of the wing. When you have a sailboat, you've got wind moving on one side of the sail faster than it is on the other. If you've got foresails, you can create a wind current that gives you lift, and so you literally pull the boat up and you don't push it. So all of this gets to a really important concept called points of sail. So when you look at the compass rose, it's divided into 32 points, each one of which is about 11 degrees, 15 minutes, 360 degrees being a complete circle. A Bermuda cruising rig, now a Bermuda rig is not gaff rigged, it's a mainmast, and it's a triangular sail that goes from the top of the mainmast down to the clew of the boom. And so it's what we normally see today on recreational sailboats. Can sail to within about 4 points of the wind, which is about a 45-degree angle. A gaff-rigged vessel could sail to within 50 to 55 degrees of the wind. So if the wind is coming from that direction, a Bermuda rig could sail at a 45-degree angle off of it. A gaff-rigged boat could sail at a 50 to 55-degree angle. A square-rigged vessel could only go at about 70 degrees to the wind direction. So it could barely get beyond the reach or perpendicular to the wind. So you were really limited in where you could take a square-rigged sailboat. One of the problems that you had is you've got a boat, you're trying to get it through the water, you're pushing it with the wind. You get a lot of drag if the bottom's dirty. And boy, were we good at dirty bottoms. So every 2 to 3 months, sailboats needed to be hauled out of the water and careened and have all of the barnacles and seaweed taken off the bottoms because you got so much fouling that it kept them from sailing efficiently through the water. What they would do is they would careen the boat, run flame across it to burn some of the seaweed and kill the barnacles, and then they literally would scrape those off every 2 to 3 months. Normally, at least once a year, you had to pull the whole boat out and repair the hull. So the British Navy, the English Navy, kept wonderful records, which you can now access online, because I did, that told you how often they replaced the hulls on British men of war. And their expectation was that with good English oak, they would have to replace every plank on the hull at least once every 7.5 years because they got eaten up primarily because of shipworms, which we will talk about in a second. So once a year, you had to get those boats out of the water. Every 2 to 3 months, you're burning all the crud off the bottom so it can go through. But you had an expectation that you were going to have to do major repairs on the bottom at least once a year, which says you were going to have to replace the planking or parts of the planking to deal with dry rot and damaged planking. You would fill all of the seams and cracks with oakum, and you would replace the standing and running rigging on the boat. So it was a major effort. Once you had done that, the hull would be coated with a mixture of tar, sulfur, and tallow, which was partially to help waterproof it, and they thought to keep these boring worms from getting into it. Didn't work very well. But if you had a regular merchant ship, you could take it to a shipyard, and they had provisions to allow them to get the boats out of the water or to careen them easily. If you were a pirate, you weren't allowed to go into a major shipyard because they knew who you were, they didn't like you. And so they had to careen by running them aground, letting the tide go out, pulling the boat to one side, exposing that bottom. You had to be careful when you did it because you wanted to make real sure you didn't come in on a moon tide or a king tide, so that you put it up on the shore and the tide went out. When it came back in, didn't come in as far. And so now you're stuck. So they would do this on a regular basis. So every 2 to 3 months, they would go through and clean the bottoms on these puppies. The problem was these boring worms. Torrido navalis, commonly called a naval shipworm. So it looks relatively innocent. These puppies would grab onto a boat and burrow their way in. And they could end up being 18 to 24 inches long, and up to half an inch in diameter, and they ate everything in their way. Now, as they ate in, the shell part would go in, they would leave a small exit hole back where their tail was, they would grow into the boat. If you looked at it and it was covered, if you looked at the hull and it was covered with seaweed or whatever, you might not actually see that something had gotten in there. This area, this part of the coast, is arguably #1 in the world for its support, because of its salinity and temperature, of shipworms. So this was a great place to get them. And they were a major problem. So there are places in the world where they actually eat them. I'm a brave guy. I ain't that brave. So he buys this boat. He's going to arm it. He doesn't tell anybody he's going to become a pirate. He mentions to some people that he's thinking about becoming a privateer, but he just doesn't talk about it a whole lot. People don't ask him. So he turns it into a pirate ship. To do that, I'm going to talk briefly about the armament on a pirate ship. So pirates did not work the way that I thought they did. You see these great pictures of the pirates shooting across the water with their cannons and making people strike their colors. Well, the last thing you wanted to do was shoot your cannon at another ship, particularly if you were intending to rob it, because what would happen is it was coated with all sorts of naval stores, pitches and resins and tars. You shoot that cannonball out there, you'll start a fire and you'll burn the thing down to the waterline. So that was very non-productive. So the idea, if you were going to be a pirate, was you wanted to be able to get really close to people, and you wanted to have a lot more people on board your ship than they had on their ship, and you would ram them, and you'd jump over the gunnels, and you would take them by force. Yes, they had rifles. Yes, they had pistols, but they were not particularly effective. They were not fast to load. They were not all that dependable, because black powder and seawater are not a great combination. So he made this ship so that it could be mounted with cannons. Most of the cannons on boats of this size would be 2 to 4 pound cannons. That shoots a cannonball out that's 1.5 inches to 2.5 inches in diameter. They were not a little bit larger than a golf ball. That was the size of them. And quite frankly, when they hit the other boat, they hit it above the waterline. They could do devastating damage. There was no doubt about it. But that small hole was not immediately going to sink you. In fact, nothing was going to sink you. They were more effective if you loaded them with everything in the kitchen sink and shot it out so that you cleared the decks on the other boat, or you shot chain out of it, which was 2 weights with a piece of chain in between it so it would swing through the air and help to ruin the rigging and demast a ship. Flintlock rifles were fired by snipers from the crow's nest or rigging. Now, there are lots of stories about these guys, these snipers, primarily because of their effectiveness on British ships of war, which were huge. 3- and 4-masted boats, and they had large crow's nests. They had a lot of space up there, and you could easily get guns up to the guys that were up in the riggings. These small Bermuda boats, Bermuda sloops, there wasn't room for 2 people in the crow's nest, if they had a crow's nest. And the idea was that you would have people with rifles up there. They would go up with a supply of rifles. They might have 4 or 5 rifles. They would shoot the 4 or 5 shots, and then they would take all the guns down, reload them on deck, and take them back up again. Flintlocks, and flintlock was where we had evolved at that point in our firearms technology. Flintlocks had an effective range 75 yards or less. You had to be real close. So they had flintlocks, and they were available, but they just weren't reliable. Something that was more effective, again, those devilish Dutch, I can say that because I've got good friends that are Dutch, used a blunderbuss, which was a smaller handheld piece that basically was the early version of a shotgun. It had an effective range maybe of 25 yards. You stuffed everything you could think of down the barrel, great big barrel with a great large bell-shaped muzzle, and you fired that puppy off and it would clear the decks. That was the idea. But because it spread out so quickly, it did not go very far. Grenades were in use by pirates. When they found the Queen Anne's Revenge, which was a Blackbeard's ship, they discovered the remains of 8 or 9 grenades that sank with the ship. Grenades were simply iron balls that were hollow. They were filled with lead or iron shot and gunpowder. You attached a fuse to it, you lit it, you threw it on board the other ship. Well, how close did you have to be to throw anything, right? You had to be right there. So the idea was that you weren't going to shoot the other ship to make them surrender. You were going to threaten them, and they were going to surrender because that was safer than having you come on board and kill everybody. So they were going after other merchant ships along the coast. At that time, most pirates had basically had a mutiny on one of those merchant ships, decided they didn't like the captain. They took one of those ships and they turned it into a pirate ship. Merchantmen might be manned by 12 to 14 people for ships that were in that 60 to 75 yard length. Not a whole lot of people to sail it. Obviously, sailors are expensive. So if you were the master of a ship, you wanted to have as few as you possibly could. While they might have a couple of cannons on board, you weren't expecting to man those cannons. You barely had enough sailors to stand your watches and change sail as necessary. The pirates would take a similar boat, and instead of having 12 to 15 people on it, they would put 80. And the idea was that they would come close enough to you that they could ram your boat, they would jump over the gunwales, and they would kill you or take you over. And so they were just going to swamp you with this huge number of people. So the two weapons that they relied upon, or that they're known for, the first was the cutlass. Well, it turns out they didn't use a cutlass very much as a fighting weapon. A cutlass was incredibly valuable on a sailing ship. It basically was a machete. It is a short blade, up to 24 inches long, with a grip that's maybe 3 to 4 inches long. And the idea was that when you needed to cut through a lot of rigging real quickly, it was a heavy blade that you could use to cut and free your damaged rigging, so that if you had something break, you could cut it free and it wouldn't turn the boat over. What they relied upon far more was the slungshot. Anybody know what a slungshot is? So if you have your North Carolina concealed carry permit, you would know that it is still illegal in the state of North Carolina to have anywhere concealed about your body, except when you're on your premises, a slungshot. So a slungshot was an incredibly impressive weapon. They used sounding lines when they were navigating up and down the coast. Sounding line was a heavy weight wrapped in canvas attached to a line. They would put a knot every fathom. Somebody would stand in the front of the boat, throw that line over, and say 6 fathoms to the starboard side. Frequently, they would coat that heavy weight with tallow or wax so that when they pulled it up, they could tell what it had hit on the bottom, and they knew if it was a sandy bottom or it was something that was more organic in nature. Those were sounding weights. Somebody had the bright idea to take this much of a sounding weight, put a loop in one end of it, swing it over your head, heavy weight, 4 to 5 pounds, and bang somebody with it. And so if you had 70 or 80 guys coming over the side of your ship, swinging these puppies around their heads, they didn't throw them, they were just going to beat you to death, right? And it was very impressive, and you had all the appropriate screaming and yelling at the same time. And I personally am glad that our legislature has seen fit to make sure that it's illegal to have that weapon here today. Stede Bonnet was a different kind of pirate. He really was. He didn't know anything about sailing. He didn't know anything about navigation. He didn't know anything about fighting. And he paid his crew a salary instead of a percentage. So, if you were a sailor and you were stuck on the dock, your lot in life was not going to be very good. You had no ready source of income. You obviously had no family wealth behind you. You were going to be poor until the day you died. You were looking constantly for ships to ship out on, whatever, but there was no real future. The merchantmen didn't really like to pay sailors a whole lot of money if they didn't have to, and so the wages were extremely low. But if you became a pirate, you got a percentage of whatever they captured. You got a share, and that share could add up. And so the idea was it was sort of like playing the lottery. Maybe you were going to be a crewman on one of those pirate ships that goes out and captures the Spanish galleon or whatever. And the next thing you know, you've got 15 pounds, right? I mean, a lot of money for people who, in most cases, had never seen hard currency in their lives. Stede Bonnet's going to do this differently. He doesn't know anything about sailing or ships, fighting. He's going to pay a wage, and he's going to have the best library afloat. So the easiest way to understand Stede Bonnet and his great adventure is to look at the ships that he captured. So the way this works is you've got a merchantman that's coming down, riding the Labrador Current, going, basically they would catch them going from Boston and the northeast, coming down toward Charleston, the British West Indies. They're running before the wind, they're square rigged. They're heavily laden. If you had a boat that could sail faster than they could and could point higher, you could cut them off, and they knew that they could not escape you. And so pirates succeeded by ambushing boats. They would see them. They would get reasonably close, but frequently they would chase them for 2 and 3 days. They would get reasonably close. They would run them down. When they got close, they would hoist either solid black or solid red flag, which said, if you make us fire on you, we're going to kill everybody on board. So you've got a choice. You can either surrender or die. And since the boats were frequently of a similar size, most of the captains were smart enough to surrender. Now, this leads to the flags were black or red. Some of the pirates, as they developed a reputation for particular ruthlessness, discovered that people would surrender more quickly if the population knew that they were dealing with a deadly pirate. So this is the pirate flag that Stede Bonnet, we think that Stede Bonnet flew. So the skull and crossbones is well known, and it's the one that's popular. In fact, most of the flags were just black or red, but this was Stede Bonnet's. And so for $9.95, you can buy one of these from Amazon. I find it fascinating that you buy a flag and it says not for outdoor use. That's all right. But you'd run this puppy up the mast. So occasionally they would get relatively close by flying false colors. If they thought you were an English ship, they would put up an English ensign so that you would let them get closer. It really didn't matter. Basically, the merchantman figured out pretty quickly that if somebody just appears going the wrong way, it's not a good deal, right? Anyway, he goes out in early 1717, gets the boat, December of 1716. By 1717, he's ready to go out and cover some ground. He starts taking boats. The first one he catches, he steals provisions, clothes, and money, and then he lets it go. The second one came from Barbados. Well, he had left Barbados in the dark of night, and he didn't want people in Barbados to know he was a pirate. So he had decided that if he came across a boat from Barbados, he was going to sink it and kill everybody on it. So he catches a boat based in Barbados in June of 1717. He detains it for careening, takes some planks off of it, and he burns it. Catches another one in June, catches 2 more in June, catches another one in July, takes things off of them, provisions, clothes, money, whatever they had. People at that time, sailors, lived on salt pork, salt beef, biscuits. It was not a great existence. Those were all things that could last for some time when you were at sea. They would take that from these boats because they couldn't go into the local harbor and buy their own. They had to take it off other boats. So he goes and for the first 3 months, he captures 5 boats. He decides he's going to go down to Charleston because he's pretty happy with himself right now. Now, his sailors have figured out he doesn't know his tail end from a hole in the wall, right? But he thinks he's hot stuff. His behavior was erratic like that. He went from periods of great enthusiasm, where he thought he was invincible, to periods of deep depression. Pretty classic manic behavior, probably, in hindsight. He goes down to Charlestown in South Carolina, which is where a lot of these boats are headed at that time. And in Charlestown, he basically sets up shop outside of Charlestown, picking off boats as they come in. Continues to grab a bunch. He's been out now for 4 months. He needs to careen his boat. Now, his boat was in better shape than most because it was newer. Most of the pirates were on boats that they had captured in previous mutinies. He was coming through, and instead he had a new boat. It was faster, it was better, it made it easier for him to catch people. So it's sort of like you don't have to be the best race car driver, but if you're the only one that has a Maserati and everybody else is in a Volkswagen, you win. And that's what he did. So he careens his boat for the first time in the Cape Fear River. It was a great place to careen because you basically were protected. If you want to have a harbor and you want to encourage people to come visit you, I would suggest you not name it the Cape Fear. It says the whole story. It was not an easy place to come in. The bar is tough sailing any way you want to look at it. It's hard to get in. It is constantly shifting. Maps were considered to be good only as long as the ink that was used to draw them was wet. Because of all the tributaries on the eastern seaboard, there is more particulate sediment coming out of the Cape Fear than any other river. So this place silts up in a heartbeat. Right? So that creates bars. The channel is constantly changing. It's why we have all the pilots that are such fame here in Cape Fear because you had to have a pilot to get you up there. He careens in the Cape Fear. He then, full of himself, after he leaves Charlestown, he goes down to the coast of Florida, where several years earlier, a Spanish treasure fleet had gotten caught in a hurricane and been pushed up against the shore, and a whole bunch of those frigates and galleons had sunk. And so everybody knew that there was a whole long area down in Florida where there are all these treasure ships, and right in shallow water, you could go down there and you could get all the doubloons and gold that you wanted. He goes down there, full of himself, sees what he thinks is a Spanish merchantman, and attacks it, and discovers it's a Spanish warship. He goes in, he's standing on the deck, the Spaniards see him, they know what he is, they let loose fly with their cannons, which were substantially larger than 2 and 4 pounders, and they clear his deck. They kill 30 to 40 of his sailors. He's badly wounded. They hit him with 2 broadsides, they hit him with their guns across the aft. He basically, the people who survive are able to get the boat out and they can outpoint the Spaniard and get away, but devastated. He comes back up to recover. He goes to New Providence, which is Bermuda, and he limps in, right? He's got bodies on board that are near dead, the ones that were dead that already thrown overboard, but in horrible shape. He comes into the harbor. Everybody wonders who he is, what he is. One of the boats that's there is Blackbeard. Now, Blackbeard was an apprentice to Captain Benjamin Hornigold, who was a relatively famous pirate. Blackbeard had not earned his stripes yet. He was in command of a sloop that had 6 guns, a tiny little ship. Here comes the Revenge with Captain Bonnet. Captain Bonnet is badly injured. When he appears in the harbor, he's got bandages wrapped around his head. He's wearing his dressing gown. Blackbeard's kind of guy. Blackbeard comes over, makes friends with him, and says, hey, while you're hurting, how would you like to have somebody else help you with the duties of being the captain of this ship? And at this point, Stede Bonnet is in one of his low periods, and he's not really all that eager to stay a pirate, he thinks. And so he agrees to let Blackbeard take over his boat. So Blackbeard goes from a 6-gun boat to a 12-gun boat overnight. According to Johnson, Captain Johnson is the author of this book, A General History of the Pirates, which came out in the 1720s. Johnson, talking about Blackbeard, says that he was known as a good sailor, a most cruel, hardened villain, bold and daring to the last degree, and truly the superior in roguery. Tall, skinny guy, long black beard at a time when people didn't have a lot of beards, which he used to put matches in. He had ribbons wrapped around it, put matches in it. So as he would stand on the foredeck, or aft deck, poop deck, he would have smoke billowing around his head. He was fierce, he was scary, and people would surrender rather than fight with him. He assumes command of the Revenge. So a lot of the captures that Stede Bonnet is accredited with actually were conducted by Blackbeard, and the 2 are irrevocably linked through the rest of their lives. Going into September, they're taking boats primarily off the Virginia coast. They go a little bit north. They get into October. They're still up in the Virginia area. Blackbeard was partial to Ocracoke in that general area. They're taking a variety of things, a lot of wine, foodstuffs, things that how do you get rid of that stuff? If you can't drink it all, and apparently they tried, you would come in, you had to have somebody who would buy it. Well, it just so happened that North Carolina's governor was not above taking a slight bribe to allow stuff to come in. And so you had North Carolina became known as a haven for pirates, much to the chagrin of South Carolina and Virginia, who were considered to be the victims of said pirates. So there was a lot of angst between North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia. So he goes through October, catching a lot of ships. Blackbeard is good, the boat is fast. They capture one called La Concorde, which was a slave ship. Blackbeard says, hey, that's a big boat. And he keeps it. And he calls it the Queen Anne's Revenge. It was a 200-ton, Dutch-built, square-rigged ship. It had left the coast of Africa with 516 slaves. They had an 82-man crew plus officers. 15 of them had already died. 36 were incapacitated by scurvy and blood flow. Don't know what blood flow was. 10 crewmen were impressed when they captured this ship. They said, hey, we're going to take some of you and turn you into pirates. And so the ones they took were the crew's second cook, 3 doctors, 2 carpenters, a caulker, a navigator, and a gunsmith. The other 66 crew members and 455 slaves were put ashore on the island of Bequia. Not their problem. Now Blackbeard had his own ship. He added 22 additional cannons to it to bring the total to 36 cannons. He now has a proper ship. He lets Stede Bonnet take over captain on the Revenge again. So Bonnet gets his ship back. He's not any better, he just was convenient. So they proceed to take, now it's a 2-ship situation. You've got a small fast boat that can chase people down. You've got a larger boat that can come in after the fact and scare anybody and provide protection against a major sailing ship of war, if one should be around, they hoped. And so they were a dynamic duo. Tremendous change in the role of Stede Bonnet. On that pirate ship, on the Revenge, this is coming from a newspaper article of the time, on board the pirate sloop is Major Bonnet, but he has no command. He walks about in his morning gown and then to the books, of which he has a good library on board. He was not well of his wounds that he received by attacking that Spanish man of war, who killed and wounded him 30 or 40 men. After putting into Providence, Captain Teach comes in, takes over. Stede Bonnet is just confused. In December, there's word of a pardon being offered by the King of England that says, if you have been a pirate and you renounce your evil ways, we will not pursue you, and you can go back home, wherever that may be, and everything is forgiven. The problem is, when pirates got a buck, they spent a buck. They didn't have any money. They were dependent upon a constant refreshing of their resources. So this pardon is offered. You don't hear a whole lot about Stede Bonnet or Blackbeard from December through April. In late March, Queen Anne is getting careened. They attack a ship called the Protestant Caesar, which was a really large ship, far bigger than Stede Bonnet could handle. When that's done, they get whooped again. And so now the seamen on the Revenge are saying, Stede Bonnet's up to his old tricks, he's an incompetent. He's going to get us all killed, we're not going to get any money. So Blackbeard puts one of his sailors, a guy by the name of Richards, on board the Revenge and brings Bonnet back on board the Queen Anne's Revenge. And so once again, Stede Bonnet is replaced, but he gets credit because he owns the boat. So they cruise up and down the East Coast. They end up outside of Charlestown. Real problem with health on these sailing ships. Turns out that sailors you spend most of your life at sea, no baths, no women, lousy food. Their teeth fell out. They developed all sorts of things like scurvy. And when they came across a woman, they tended not to be gentle and understanding. So sexually transmitted diseases ran rampant. And the only way to treat people for sexually transmitted diseases that they knew at the time was to take mercury, take a tube and stick it someplace sensitive and fill that with mercury, which if ever there was a cure that would kill you, that was it. But that's what they knew to do at the time. Remember, they also bled people back then. So Blackbeard and 4 other boats go down and they blockade Charleston. And they basically say, we're not going to let you come out or in until you give us medicine. They send in, they've captured all these boats. They're capturing them outside the Charleston harbor. They send some in, a couple of pirates, a couple of hostages, and say, hey, here's the deal, guys. We want the following things from you, or we're going to kill everybody on the boats out here. So as soon as they get on shore, the pirates who are there go drinking. there's a very tight time frame. They're supposed to get a response back within 2 days. Otherwise, the pirates are going to start killing people. 2 days later, the people of Charleston have decided they're going to surrender. They're going to give all these medical supplies. They go looking for the pirates. They can't find them. They're off drunk with their buddies, right? Because all the sailors knew each other. So they're off drunk. They finally grab them, haul them back to the boat, inebriated, and ship them back out to Blackbeard, along with $300 worth of medicine in a chest. At that point, they lift the blockade on Charleston. They take off. Now, they go north. They get separated in Topsail Inlet. So they've been collecting money from a lot of boats that they have captured, and they do have some cash on board. Most of it goes to the officers, obviously, the guy who owns the boat. The share portion of it, you'd get 2 shares to a captain, a share and a half to the quartermaster. Other skilled positions would get more than a share. Common crewmen would get a single share. But the boat received its expenses first, and those frequently were padded, and the captain frequently owned the boat, and so he got the majority of the money. They get up to Topsail Inlet, and son of a gun, Blackbeard runs aground with the Queen Anne's Revenge. And he calls for another boat to come in and get him off, and that boat runs aground. The Revenge, with Stede Bonnet, does not come in. They're still afloat. Blackbeard takes everything off of the 2 boats that are now aground up in Ocracoke and moves them to a 3rd boat. Stede Bonnet leaves to go in and apply for a pardon. When he does that, Blackbeard takes all the money that he's taken off the boats and takes off. And so he basically leaves Stede Bonnet high and dry with none of his share of the loot. Stede Bonnet goes and accepts a pardon from the governor of North Carolina. Questionable, because technically you weren't supposed to give a pardon to somebody who had attacked an English ship after a certain date, and Bonnet certainly had done that. But with the provision of a couple of pipes of Madeira wine, he was able to convince the governor to let him have the pardon. He gets it. Bonnet takes the Revenge, renames it the Royal James. Got to keep my Jameses straight here. The Royal James, and changes his name to Captain Thomas, in hopes that he could go off and be unknown, start a new life. He's going to go down to St. Thomas, get a letter of, as a privateer, get a letter of marque, and go off and raid the Spanish again. That was the plan. However, as he's got a boat, he doesn't have any provisions, he doesn't have enough men. He comes up to where Blackbeard had been. When Blackbeard took off, he had more sailors than he had room for them. He marooned a bunch of his own sailors. Marooning says you put them on some sort of a key or bar, and you left them there to die. Bonnet comes behind him, picks up 15 or 16 of Blackbeard's sailors that were the ones that Blackbeard didn't really want, right? Now, Bonnet is determined he's going to go catch up with Blackbeard and get his money back. So he's going to go looking for him. He thinks that he's coming down south. It was his expectation. As it turns out, Blackbeard was going back up to Ocracoke, so he did a loop around him. Meanwhile, Bonnet's coming down here. Bonnet really makes it sound like he was going to try to be legit. So he's still pulling ships over, but he's giving them something for whatever it is he's taking. So he might take molasses from you, but he'd give you a couple of kegs of rice. And the thought, he was going to argue that he was on the straight and narrow now. He was just a tradesman, and he was swapping this stuff off. The sailors don't particularly like that system. They might as well be pirates. They are in everything but name. So they elect a new quartermaster. Quartermaster is the person who divvies up the shares when you capture a prize. They elect a new quartermaster by the name of Robert Tucker, that they had recently brought on board from a ship that they had caught. And apparently Tucker was a real SOB. I mean, he was a hard driver. And he took Bonnet and put him back in his stateroom and said, "Stay there, buddy, don't come out. I'll run your ship for you now." So throughout July into August, they are working this coast. They finally stop pretending they're anything other than pirates. They're taking lots of boats, but they're not getting a whole lot off of anything on them. They're picking up some silver and gold, but not a lot. They get into the fall, and it's time to careen again. So they come down to the Cape Fear in August, and they careen somewhere that we probably could hit it with a good 3-wood from right here. So when you look at the charts for the Cape Fear, there are all sorts of islands that occur along this part of the channel. They're constantly moving. And just as we're having a hard time deciding whether we're looking at Bird Island or Battery Island, and I don't want to get into that war, but this bar was constantly moving because of all the silt coming down and the impact of storms coming in. And so this was known as a good place to careen because the big ships couldn't come in, so you weren't going to be heeled over on your side. It would take about a week to do the basic scraping. It could take up to a month and a half if you were replacing boards. This was a good place to go because you weren't going to get attacked by a large man of war because they couldn't make it through by Smith Island. They could not come in by Bald Head. The channel was too narrow. It was too dangerous. The water shifted too often. So it was a place to hide. So he comes in here to hide in August. Looking at this map, and maps can be obviously deceiving, but you've got Cape Fear. This is known variously as Smith Island and Bald Head, now Bald Head Island. Here is the fort. This is after, obviously, they were there. But you have this row of islands that's along here, and as I looked at several charts at various times, you will notice that the islands are always moving, they're always differently shaped, but they're in basically the same area, right? So that's where the sandbar is formed because you had water coming down from the river and water coming in from the ocean. This leads to the Battle of the Sandbar. He has careened his ship. He's doing a major refitting. He is replacing a bunch of the planks on the deck. After they had blockaded Charlestown and gotten that medicine from them, they really upset the people in Charlestown, and they upset the governor there. And he decided they were going to have to put an end to this scourge of piracy. They requested help from the British Navy, and the British were busy doing other things at the time, and so they could not provide a man of war to go chase all those pirates. Colonel William Rhett calls for a conference with Governor Johnson of South Carolina and offers to take 2 sloops and pursue the pirates. Johnson gives him a commission and full power to fit such vessels as he thought proper for the design, meaning chasing pirates. Rhett takes a week and puts together the Henry and the Sea Nymph, one with 8 guns and 70 men, the other with 8 guns and 60 men, both captained by able seamen, and they leave September 15th, heading after a pirate by the name of Vane, who they thought had gone south from Charlestown. They go look for him, they can't find him. They hear word that there is somebody who has careened up here in the Cape Fear. They get this from a merchantman that has come by and been captured actually for a short period of time by Bonnet. Stuff was taken from him. They knew that Bonnet was coming in here. So Rhett turns around and comes up to the Cape Fear looking to find somebody. September 26, 1718, Rhett enters the Cape Fear and sees the mass of 3 ships at anchor over the island, quote unquote, beyond the peninsula and less than a mile up the river. So this is where the islands are, right here. You can see the islands. They're just not the same shape, but the nautical that artifact. So within a mile of here, right, along this bank, there was an area that was where the beach was suitable for careening your ship. So by the time he comes in, Rhett comes in, they have done the repair work on the hulls. The boats are floated again, but they haven't left. Rhett comes in, hires a pilot to get him inside the bay, and the pilot promptly runs both of Rhett's boats aground, right? So September 26th, they see them, they come in, tide goes out, they both get grounded. By this point, Bonnet can see the ships, can see Rhett's, the mass of Rhett's ships. He sends 3 canoes out to see who they are, because he doesn't know if he assumes they're merchantmen, right? He sends 3 canoes out. Canoes at that time were basically dugouts up to 35 feet in length, usually no more than 3 feet width, so they were long and narrow, relatively fast, paddled. You put a couple of guys with a rifle in there, you go up and you see what's there, you tell them you're pirates, and if they don't surrender, you're going to come back with the real boat and get them. They go up, they go to the other side of the island where Rhett is by now back afloat, and they realize their mistake, that this is not a merchantman for the easy pickings, so they hightail it back to Bonnet. Bonnet realizes he's in for a fight. He's got 2 ships in here. He puts all of his men on one ship. He's going to make a break for it in the morning, go down the channel, and try to split the 2 boats that Rhett has to get out. Bonnet had a hard time getting his guys to fight. Some of the sailors that were on board, Blackbeard had kicked them out for a reason. They didn't have all that much enthusiasm to get themselves killed. So Bonnet did not want, he's in one of his egotistical modes. He's going to go take on whoever this is that's chasing him. He's got more men. He thinks he's going to be victorious. He's going to tear off down the river. He's going to go out in the morning. He's going to split the 2 boats, and he's going to be gone, right? He writes a letter to the governor of South Carolina, which he's got hostages on board his ship from boats that he had taken earlier. He writes this letter and gives it to one of the guys that's on board. It's a letter to the governor of South Carolina saying, hey, if these boats really do turn out to be boats that are here to capture me, he was going to burn and destroy all the ships or vessels going in or coming out of South Carolina. So that was his threat, right? Oops. Bonnet brings the Royal James out early in the morning, starts to go down, gets on full speed, and promptly runs aground. Rhett is attempting to come in the opposite direction to cut him off, and both of his ships run aground. So now you have 3 ships that are all aground. When they go aground, they all list to the same side. It just so happens that the first of Rhett's boats is out of the range of the other 2, but the Henry and the Royal James are within shouting distance of each other, because that's what they proceed to do. Now, with the way they're both listed over, Bonnet has protection from gunfire coming from Rhett's boat. Rhett has an exposed deck, and so the early part of the battle is very much to the advantage of the gentleman pirate. And he's using pistols and rifles. They are screaming and yelling at each other. They know each other by name. These sailors, you're a pirate one day and you're fighting the next on the side of the government. So they know each other. So they're screaming and yelling at each other. At most 50 yards apart, right? It's a narrow channel. The pirate crew is goading and mocking the Henry and waving their hats in derision. The Henry is no better, saying they were going to speak with him by and by. What happens is the tide comes in, and the Henry refloats first. The Henry goes out, repairs its rigging, and comes back in. The Sea Nymph floats, which is the second boat that Rhett has, goes out, comes back in. Now, Stede Bonnet is faced with 2 boats that are in better shape than his is and are ready to do battle. So he does what any brave pirate would do. He runs up a a white flag, and he surrenders. Just like that, it's over. So after all of the words that they had yelled back and forth at each other, when push came to shove, he surrenders. Rhett leaves the Cape Fear 3 days later. He repairs all the boats and takes all 3 boats down to Charleston. So it was the 10 members of the Henry were killed, 14 were wounded. The Sea Nymph, basically out of range, had 2 people killed, 4 wounded. The Royal James had 7 people killed and 5 wounded, 2 of which died within the day. So really had 9 killed. But he had a smaller group of sailors than Rhett did on the 2 boats. They arrive in Charlestown. This is greeted with delirium by the South Carolinians because they've caught a couple of pirates. The Carolina General Assembly meets in emergency session on October 17th, and they adopt an act for the more speedy and regular trial of pirates. They're going to do this quickly. They appoint a judge, Nicholas Trott, who's the brother-in-law of Colonel Rhett. They put in a grand jury, 23 members. They're sworn in, and they indict 34 individuals on 2 different counts of piracy for 2 ships that they had seized. Now, obviously, they had seized some 40-plus ships, but they have them on 2 because they have people who were on the 2 ships that were seized, and they could bring the charges directly. The way that trials worked back then, nobody was defended by counsel. Incredibly detailed information on this trial is available because the full trial record was written by the governor and the judge, and it's published online, and you can go out and find it today. It's available online for free. Major Bonnet, because he was a gentleman, was scheduled to be tried separately. 30 of his crew pled not guilty. 2 pled guilty to both indictments, and 1 pled guilty to 1 indictment. God knows why they made that difference. The crew of the Royal James was detained in what served as their jail at the time, which was the Watch House. It was a 1-story building. They were in 2 small rooms. It must have stunk to high heaven, to put it politely, but they were contained there. Bonnet was a gentleman, and we all knew that he was a gentleman, so they would never force him to stay in those conditions, so they put him in the house of the Provost Marshal, Nathaniel Partridge, and he stayed there. 2 other sailors who were going to testify against the other pirates join him as preferential treatment for agreeing to testify. They move into this house. On October 24th, Bonnet and 1 of the 2 people that were there bribed their guards and they escape. Apparently it wasn't real difficult. There were a lot of people in Charleston who felt that because Bonnet was a gentleman, he shouldn't be on trial in the first place. Status and class carried a tremendous amount of weight. So they all hated pirates, but they didn't know how to deal with a pirate who was a gentleman, and clearly he was a gentleman. The governor issues a 700-pound reward for the recapture of Stede Bonnet, but there's no reason to slow the trial down of the crew. So I think it's interesting when you look at where his crew came from. We don't have all of them identified, but 3 of them were from Charlestown. So they were based in the harbor that they had attacked. 4 were from North Carolina, 6 were from Jamaica. When the people from Barbados, when they had that migration out, they went to Jamaica and the Carolinas. 3 were from Aberdeen, Scotland. Then you had a whole bunch that were from England. 5 were from London, 1 was from Holland, 1 from Dublin, and 1 from Oporto, which was a Portuguese location. On November 5th, they didn't waste a whole lot of time. November 5th, 29 members of Bonnet's crew were found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. 4 members of the crew were acquitted. They were able to make the argument that they were forced to become a pirate and sign the contract. November 6th, Stede Bonnet, who had escaped, gets captured on Sullivan's Island. November 7th, the governor of South Carolina, because it's so popular to be a pirate catcher now, decides there is a threat from another pirate offshore. He puts together a fleet to go out and try to catch the next group of pirates. In that fleet are the Sea Nymph and the Royal James. So Bonnet's boat comes back. Control of it is assumed by the governor, and the governor turns it into a fighting ship. So it just got recycled. Pirate one day, privateer the next, no problem. They go out looking for a pirate by the name of Christopher Moody. Unfortunately, a gentleman who had just become a pirate had left New York in a rowboat with 8 other people, went out, stole a merchantman, boarded it, turned it into a pirate ship, came down the coast, runs into South Carolina as a pirate. He's been a pirate for 6 blooming weeks, right? So if you think Stede Bonnet was bad, this guy was no better. He gets attacked by the governor, the Royal James, and gets killed in the battle. November 8th, 29 members of Bonnet's crew were hanged. So convicted on the 3rd, hung on the 8th. November 10th, the Admiralty Court comes back. They reconvene to try Stede Bonnet on 2 charges of piracy. Bonnet makes an argument in his own defense on the first charge. He brings in a witness who says that he heard somebody say that the commissioner of North Carolina, Governor Eden, had given him a commission to sail to St. Thomas to get a letter of marque to become a privateer against the Spanish. The grand jury says, "What the hell are you talking about?" And they find him guilty, right? So November 10th, they find him guilty on the first charge of piracy. On the 11th, they're going to reconvene and try him on the second charge. Bonnet says, "Oh, hell, I'm guilty," and pleads guilty to the second charge. On the 12th, Judge Trott sentences him to death by hanging. On December 10th, he's taken to White Point in Charlestown and hung. Now, in that intervening month, what happened was all sorts of people made requests for pardons on his behalf. A bunch of the families of Charlestown said, you can't hang this guy. Captain Rhett agreed, Colonel Rhett agreed that he would take Bonnet back to England so he could be tried by a real English court and see if he really should be hung. The governor didn't want to hear anything of it. He had him, he had validation to hang him, and he hung him. But Bonnet was, doing everything he could to try to get a pardon, etc. So December 10th, he's gone. So think about it. He gets the ship December 16th of 1716. By December 10th of 1718, he is dead. He is hung. So it is a short but spectacular life. Mary Bonnet, his wife, dies in 1750. She stays on the island of Barbados. She's still got the estate. He never saw her after he left in the dark of night to go be a pirate. She's got 3 kids. She moves to a house in the parish that her parents came from, where she was back with society or with her own family, but she's there. So it's interesting how he has been pictured. People couldn't believe that a guy who had all the advantages that he had would go out and become a bloodthirsty pirate. It didn't make sense. It's like discovering that your next door neighbor is a cannibal and has bodies buried in the basement, right? He's got to be nuts. He's got to be nuts. And so this feeling that there had to be something really wrong with Stede Bonnet is exacerbated by this general book of the pirates written by Johnson, who writes that he was a gentleman of good reputation in the island of Barbados, master of a plentiful fortune, had the advantage of a liberal education, least temptation of any man to follow such a course of life from the condition of his circumstances. Very surprising to everyone to hear of his enterprise in the island where he lived, as he was generally esteemed and honored before he broke out into the open acts of piracy. So he was to be pitied rather than condemned. So this concept that Stede Bonnet was somehow facing a midlife crisis, he may well have been. I'm not arguing that. But because Johnson comes out with this, and it's the first book off the presses in 1725, now, how would Johnson know between December of 18 and 25, he wrote what he thought he had to be nuts, right? So there was no research involved. And Johnson's book, we don't know who Johnson was. There have been several attempts to identify who he is. Nobody knows for sure who wrote the book, right? But it was a bestseller. So that word gets out, and the word is out that Bonnet had problems sometime before this wicked undertaking, which is said to have been occasioned by some discomforts he found in a married state. His wife drove him to it. That's his story, and he's sticking to it. So, that's the short but spectacular life of Stede Bonnet. Short, 2 years, of which only about 18 months were actually spent as a pirate. Most of his pirating was accomplished when it was under the command of Blackbeard, who was one evil, malevolent son of a gun, right? And so there was no doubt about the cruelty involved, but it was very, very quick. Age of piracy wasn't very long. It was a horrible existence. Most of the people who were pirates were dead within 2 to 3 years anyway. A lot of them from disease, sickness, starvation. It was just a lousy existence. But if you had no future, go play the lottery. Become a pirate. Stede Bonnet had a future. He just didn't like it. He wanted to be daring and brave. He read the books. He wanted to be the next Captain Cook or Captain Kidd. Off he goes. And it ended up in a disaster. So that's the story of Stede Bonnet. It happened right here. Now, Charleston will tell you that Stede Bonnet is Charleston's pirate. And Barbados will tell you that Stede Bonnet is Barbados's pirate, because when you get a good story, you grab it, right? So one of the problems that I had when I was doing all this research is there are lots of booklets like this, right? And I think it's great. Anything that gets kids reading, I think, is wonderful. A little light on history and fact. Great on story. And so you get a picture of the pirates from a very early age, and you're exposed to them on TikTok and YouTube and HBO, of this glamorous existence and glamorous life. This was the graveyard of the Atlantic, folks. Boats disappeared here all the time. They just went away. And so it was not a glamorous existence, but that's the picture we've drawn of pirates. But that's our relationship to it. So he was here at least 3 times to careen his boat, and he was captured here. So we have as much a right to claim him as anybody. I mean, hell, I'm going to find out he was married to one of my cousins at some point. So that's just the way we work it with history, right? So that is the story of Stede Bonnet that I was able to find. The information that was really useful to me, the British registry keeps track of ships that paid taxes, that left ports. You can go back and you can find ships that disappeared. In some cases, those records were updated to say that they were lost at sea, but some cases it was identified that they were lost to pirates. The English had an incredible accounting system, and so they paid those merchant ships. They expected to get a profit on them. They kept records on them. They wrote down when somebody got raided. We don't always know who the pirate was who got them, because there were lots of small pirates doing this, but enough that you can use those original British Admiralty records to get a pretty good idea of the boats that were disappearing on this part of the coast, right? Nobody wanted to go and mess with a Spanish galleon. So the pirates, as romantic as it makes it sound that you're going to go take one of those gold-bearing galleons, no, they're going to blow you out of the water, right? So it basically was the coastal shipping that they hit right through here. They played an important role because the pirates, when they seized those goods, would take them into places like New Bern, and they would sell the goods that were intended to go to the rich people in Charleston, or go to the rich people in Boston, or go to New York. And instead they got shortcut and they ended up here. So that's how it worked, and they fed some colonies. North Carolina was very receptive to that. South Carolina and Virginia were not. So that's the story. Not way over time, but a little bit. Any questions? One thing I uncovered as I did this, one of the ships that Stede Bonnet captured had 60 slaves on it. And he couldn't do anything with the slaves. He didn't have any way to sell them. And he wasn't going to turn them into sailors. So he brings them into the Cape Fear. He's going to let them go. He's going to let the ship go because he has no use for it. So he takes their sails, or most of their sails. He takes most of their extra spars, cuts their masts off, and shoves them offshore. They go out and they head for Charleston. That's the closest port, and it's the direction that the currents are running. He doesn't give them a lot of provisions, so you've got the captain, his crew, and all these slaves, and no food. They're going down the coast of Brunswick County, no food. So they stop, and they take all the slaves, and they kick them off. And they put them on shore in Brunswick County in the Green Swamp. And so they were chattel, right? They end up in the Green Swamp. So I'm starting to uncover stuff about Caruso and the Green Swamp and the population that occurred here that wasn't discovered until, or wasn't widely explored until the late 1930s. This culture that grew up that had a French influence from people that had escaped from Haiti during one of the slave revolutions, a mixture of black and white, people just trying to get away and hide, and the Green Swamp was incredibly inhospitable. So this has gotten me back deeper into the Green Swamp. And so for those of you who might be interested in something that we could actually go visit the places, the Green Swamp is right there. So anyway, thank you very, very much.